Right. Well, London, the medieval London Bridge with houses on it is one of the best known images of London in the past, but until now we've known very little about the houses themselves. The picture I've put up, when we'll see it again later in various guises, is one of the reconstruction drawings done to accompany the book that's been set out there. It shows only the middle part of the bridge in about 1590. And it looks a bit like an anthill because it's a cutaway view, so you can see inside the houses and so on. And what you're about to hear is based on new research. The bridge itself, as we've heard, it's the medieval one, built between 1179 and 1209, and it has houses on it up to 1761, and then it carries on without houses until 1831, when it's replaced by a new bridge on a new site slightly further west. If you know the area, St. Magnus the Martyr Church is at the north end of the old bridge. There are three detailed contemporary views of the bridge, as it was before the rebuilding in the 1680s. At the top there you've got Anthony van Wingard, about 1544, showing the east side, and we'll look a bit more closely at some of the buildings later. In the middle is an anonymous view in the Pepys Library in Cambridge, which could be any period from 1590 to 1633. It shows the west side. And at the bottom there is John Norden's view of 1597-98, again showing the east side. And they are in fact fairly accurate, but they're quite limited in what they show us. They show us the backs of the houses. They don't give us much idea of the size of the houses, what they were like facing the street, what they were like inside. Now here's the old view of London Bridge. You probably know it. It's the model in St. Magnus the Martyr. And in that view, the piers of the bridge just have triangular cutwaters. The buildings are very shallow. They're supported from the bridge on struts. There are random gaps in the houses, and the houses are linked together only at the top. All of those things I've just described are wrong, as you'll see in a moment. So what is the new information? Firstly, a set of measurements made in 1683, just before most of the houses were demolished. And if I bring up part of it, you can see it gives you the breadth in front, so the width of the houses, and then it gives you the width of something it calls the cross buildings. These are feet and inches, by the way. And then it gives you the depth of the houses from front to back. And then in this column here, at certain points, it gives you the width of the roadway. And it's these dimensions that are what we've not had before. The other new source is the leases of the bridge houses, which from 1604 to 1660, they have all the usual stuff, but they have a couple of lines which set out exactly what the rooms were in each house and their dimensions. And almost every house on the bridge is covered, and some of them several times. And if you're wondering why no one's used them before, it's because they're still held by the lawyers at the Guildhall, and they're not terribly easy to get at. And there's no index, but fortunately they were listed by a diligent clerk of the Bridge House in 1787, and that's how I managed to work out what existed. So the new information, well, starting with the width of the street, it's usually been said to be very narrow, 12 feet, maybe 14 feet. Here you've got 14, 15, 16, 14. And in fact, this and the other parts of the bridge, it's normally about 15 feet, except where you've got a defensive feature, where obviously you don't want to make it too wide. And here, for example, 12 feet 5 inches, that was the drawbridge tower, and Nonsuch House evidently took the same footings, and it remained the same width. And it's actually the width also of the drawbridge, which was just south of Nonsuch House. Maybe difference between 12 feet and 15 feet doesn't seem very important, but it matters because the structure of the bridge itself is only 21 to 24 feet wide. So the houses on each side, they're only occupying about 3 to 5 feet. So they're not largely on the bridge, just poking over the edge a little. They in fact only have a toehold on the bridge. And yet, some of them are 34 feet deep. So they can't be supported by struts from the bridge, and we'll see how you do support them. That's the French way of doing it in Paris, where you spend a lot of money and you have a very wide structure for the arches and piers, which is about the same width as houses plus roadway. But you can only do that if you've either got heaps of money or your bridge is very short, as they were in Paris. Or in Bristol, apparently, it's just struts and very narrow houses, but I'd like to see a proper plan of it. Or at Newcastle, you build mainly on the piers. But what you do at London instead is that you have very long piers, and you combine them with what they called hammer beams from pier to pier, parallel to the roadway. So, in fact, the other news source is 2 plans of the bridge. The one at the top was drawn after a fire in 1633, and there you've got the first 7 starlings and their piers and the widened roadway. And the important thing to see there is that the piers, even the straight bits, go well beyond the roadway. And the lower one, which turned up in Wiltshire Record Office, is drawn by an engineer, Charles Laberley, in 1746, and it only shows the starlings in green and the piers in orange, but nevertheless it's a really good basis for plotting the roadway and the houses on the map. So here you've got bit of John Norden's view here, and here clearly is a hammer beam with some braces supporting it. You've probably got a hammer beam there, and again braces and further structures there. Down below is part of the reconstruction drawing of around 1590, and here you see some hammer beams and timbers on them. And that's how you can build very large houses. So the uniqueness of London Bridge is the use of long piers and hammer beams for the whole of a major bridge. The other thing that the table of measurements gave us in 1683 is something about cross buildings. Indeed, they covered about half of the built-up roadway. So roughly every other house, there's a cross building between the houses on the 2 sides. They don't tell us what a cross building was, but the reason for rebuilding in the 1680s was not only to widen the roadway to 20 feet, but also to increase its height from 1 story to 2. And the leases confirm that the cross buildings began in the 1st story and went up to the top. And there are some measurements showing they were only 10 feet off the roadway. So if we go back to a 1590 view, and incidentally, the reason for the cross buildings, it's not really to hold the buildings together and stop them toppling into the river, because you would really be chancing your luck if you hoped they would do that. They're to provide stability, I think, because the houses are subject to very strong winds. So here we've got the long piers, the hammer beams, the 1st story cross buildings, obviously they're cut away on this side, and very deep houses, going quite a way beyond on each side of the bridge. And now, of course, we've got the dimensions of the road, and we know about the cross buildings. We can reconstruct what the roadway would have looked like, and there it is, part of the northern part of the bridge as it would have been in about 1630. Clearly rather claustrophobic, and it makes sense of some of the early observations that the bridge was like a continual street and vaulted over. In fact, one writer says it was covered throughout its own length, but that would have made life rather difficult without electric lighting. But you can begin to see what he meant. Now, we haven't quite finished with what the measurements tell us. because they also enable us to pick out the individual houses. So that is the middle west, sorry, that's, which is it, middle east part of the bridge, with the houses picked out from Nonsuch House to the old chapel and then the first building there. Some of them only 10 feet wide, others wider. The inaccuracy is that Norden, obviously excited by Nonsuch House and the chapel, makes them a bit too wide. The other thing we can do is plot the houses on a map. In there, the piers are in red, and the numbering is my own, as I used in the book. The grey is the cross buildings over the street. And although most of the new information I've talked about is from the 17th century, this map is really the key to unlocking the earlier history, because we have rentals going back to 1460, almost annual, another set of rentals 1404 to 1421, and a survey of 1358. And that means we can trace the houses back to 1358, working out when they've been altered, when plots have been merged, and so on. So the rest of what I'm going to say will be a bit more chronological now I've introduced the structure, starting with the building in 1179 to 1209, or perhaps those dates, they're not absolutely certain. And there is a Museum of London Archaeology reconstruction on the left and Peter Jackson's on the right. So as David's described, you start at low tide driving in piles, you fill that in and you create your piers, then you've got a working surface to drive in larger piles to create the starlings around the piers, by which time, of course, you've virtually dammed the river up. But it nevertheless worked. So when did the houses appear? Well, King John in 1202 refers to the houses that are to be built on the bridge. So in the last stage of the building, they're thinking about the houses. And also the long piers are a pretty good indication that they were going to use them so they could build houses, because there's no reason that I can think of otherwise why you need those long piers. And the houses are not just an integral part of the structure, they're an integral part of the economics. They provide about a quarter of the income of London Bridge. Now, I said we traced back the houses to 1358, and there I've had to divide it into two, obviously, is the survey of 1358 with the numbering of that period mapped out. Because there are a number of things that become clear when using the 1358 survey. First of all, there are no houses between the Stone Gate and the Drawbridge Tower here. The reason clearly being that it's a military area. When they built on it later on, they were twice burnt down during revolts, which showed that the original impulse had been a good one. To my surprise, once the plots had all been tracked back to 1358, there was a regular plan, or reasonably regular. The houses were all originally about 10 feet wide. So it's laid out a bit like a medieval new town, although obviously without long burgage plots. It's unlikely they would just lock up shops, but at the time there were not many houses with more than 2 stories, so almost certainly they had 2 stories. And there is reconstruction showing what it might have been like. You also have the 3 major buildings, the chapel, the Drawbridge Tower, and the Stone Gate, all of which, of course, are completely conjectural because we don't know what they looked like in that period. And here are your 10 feet wide houses with their cross buildings. Because the other thing that happened when working out the 1358 survey is that it referred to some mysterious things called outpa, or high places. And when plotted on the map, they were in exactly the same points on the bridge as the cross buildings in the 17th century. They were the same thing. And that's clearly why they start on the first story, because there were only ground story and first story when they originated. here are the three main buildings as shown on Wingard's drawing of 1544. So on the left, you've got the chapel as rebuilt between 1387 and 1396 by Henry Yeveley, converted to a house, or largely demolished, but the bottom part surviving, converted to a house in 1553. In the middle is the drawbridge tower of 1426, demolished in 1577. On the right-hand side is the stone gate, built in the 1470s, and much altered. It survived until the houses were removed. I should also mention that all the houses were owned by the body that ran the bridge, called the Bridge House, loosely supervised by the City of London, and they built the houses, they kept control of them, leased them out, and they also maintained them until the 17th century. So what happens after 1358? A number of different things. They fill in the gap between the drawbridge tower and the stone gate, probably in the 1360s and 70s, and after that the same four groups of houses survive until the end of the life of the houses. Many of the house plots are merged because 10 feet has become too small, so sometimes they become 20 feet, sometimes groups of them are rebuilt together, which is why by the 17th century you can't really see what the original arrangement was. And many of them are rebuilt, usually with more stories and with greater depth. And the rebuilding is revealed in the accounts, though usually with reference to named tenants rather than where they were. But having tracked all the plots back to 1358, we now know where they are, so we can say from 1460 when the individual houses were built. And of the 91 houses there in 1600, 66 of them can be dated. The remaining 25 almost certainly are pre-1460. They, for example, they include the smallest surviving houses. Most of the rebuilding takes place between 1477 and 1548, especially the last couple of decades, because the Bridge House happens to have a lot of money then, so they can afford to do it. And there you see an example. It's the middle west part of the bridge, and at the top in blue you can see the dates of those houses. It's not obvious from the view that some are older than others.
Middle south, probably?
Sorry?
Middle south?
Middle west.
You mean the bridge ran north south, surely?
The bridge goes north-south, but they have the groups of houses. The principal part is at the north end. Then the middle part divided into the middle west, which is the houses on the west side, and the middle east, which is the houses on the east side. And then you have what they call the end of the bridge, or sometimes the south end, which is the remaining two groups. Yeah. So the largest single project is 10 houses at the south end of the principal part here with the two towers, designed by Humphrey Coke, who was the bridge's chief carpenter, as well as being the king's master carpenter. Rather more interesting, just north of the stone gate are 6 houses here, with this remarkable south facade with semicircular projections and windows going right across the facade. And it's generally been regarded as Elizabethan, but the accounts show they were actually built in 1547 to 48, designed by Richard Ambrose, who was Coke's successor, and again he's involved in the royal works. He's the master carpenter in the tower, and it's innovative and it's reminiscent of Henry VIII's recently built Nonsuch Palace. So architecturally the bridge was bang up to date. Then we have Nonsuch House. They demolished the drawbridge tower in 1577 to 9 and replaced it by the bridge's most notable building. You see it here as drawn by Holler in 1647. Despite the name, it's actually just 2 large houses. But it's a good example of the value of making a reconstruction drawing, which throws up all sorts of questions which one would really have liked to avoid, but one is forced to confront. And although Hollow looks like the most detailed view, the shape is all wrong. And if we look at the other drawings, we get something very different. On the right, the view of 1600, and it's a bit grainy, but it's got pillars with golden capitals. And here you've got 4 light windows in the first and second stories. And we ended up with something like that. Not a bit of robust, rustic Elizabethan carpentry, but one of the earliest classical facades in London. And in fact, we know the architect, who was a man called Lewis Stockett, who was both the chief carpenter of the Bridge House and the Queen's surveyor of the works. And he'd also worked on the Strand facade of Somerset House, which is the earliest classical facade. So, and it hardly needs saying it was not, as all the books will tell you, prefabricated in Holland and brought over. You didn't need to do that. So here we have one of the earliest classical facades in the country, hiding on the most prominent site in London. And not surprisingly, it's in the late 16th century that foreign visitors are most excited about the bridge. And we can begin to understand now what made it exciting to them. It's partly the length, because although there are other inhabited bridges in England and in Europe, it's the longest. It's partly the amount of trade on the bridge. It's partly the up-to-date architecture, with the architecture concentrated on the ends of the groups of houses, like there, designed to be seen by people crossing the bridge, not people drawing it from a boat. And it's partly the great width of the houses from east to west, so that's about 75 feet from east to west, and similarly the end of the principal part. Now let's look inside the houses. They're reconstructed from one of the leases, is 2 of the houses on the middle part of the bridge. All the houses, of course, are timber, though they have brick chimneys. And they're almost all 3.5 or 4.5 stories, the half stories being the garrets. And they vary greatly in size, but this gives you the standard plan. So, as here in about 1650, so you have always a shop on the ground floor, then a hall and possibly a chamber above it, kitchen and chamber above that, and then chambers and garrets, and often also a cellar. Here's the same thing, again turned into a reconstruction drawing. So at the bottom, the houses over the piers had cellars within the stonework. If they're over the arches or the gullets, either they've got no cellars or they've got what's called a hanging cellar, which must have been hanging from the hammer beams, and it's usually long and thin, sometimes only 2.5 or 3 feet wide, and I think those ones must have been accessed from trapdoors rather than from stairs, though others were a bit wider. Then you've got your shop on the ground floor, and I think the trading would have been mainly in the shop and not on the counter facing the street, because the street is very busy, there's a risk of theft, and the sort of goods sold were ones where the customer needed to compare different products. They're not buying standard items, as we'll see. Then you have the hall on the first floor and the kitchen above, and the reason for that is the hall is almost invariably on the riverside if there's more than one room, and I think that's for the views, and they very often have a balcony as well, or a lead as they called it. And then the kitchen also needs to be on the riverside because you have your water house where you let down your bucket to bring up the water. So the kitchen and the hall can't be on the same floor. You have to choose one of them to be on the first floor. And then also you have your cross buildings here, which either are part of the same room, as you see there with the hall, or they have a separate room. Some problems with lighting the house attached to the cross building, and probably impossible to heat them because there's no way of getting the weight of a chimney down to the ground. There's another house from the view I showed you first. Again, the same plan, shop, hall, kitchen, chambers and garrets. and cross-building. Now, I said all the houses are shop houses, and it's one of the 4 or 5 main shopping streets in the city, but it's not like places of heavy footfall today with fast food and souvenirs. There were virtually no inns or alehouses until the 18th century, and they're not selling everyday necessities like bread or items you might buy on impulse. They're much more specialised. Indeed, if we look at how they were in 1478, there I put the whole bridge up on the left and the principal or northern part on the right, because the rental happens to give occupations in that year. And in the late 14th century and in 1478, there are 5 groups that dominate: haberdashers, which are in purple there, glovers, which are brown, cutlers blue, bowyers red, and fletchers orange. And they're nearly always selling goods rather than making them on the bridge. And over time, although the haberdashers are there to the end, there are changes by about 1600. The other 4 early trades have gone and are replaced by more haberdashers, by dealers in textiles, and by grocers. And from about the 1680s, the grocers go and the textile dealers, and there's a much more miscellaneous set of traders, including booksellers, stationers, pin makers, needle makers, and so on. They're generally a prosperous tradesmen, but they're not in the first rank of traders in the city. They're not merchants or masters of the large livery companies or aldermen, but they might be masters of the smaller companies, and occasionally they're members of the city's common council. There are no great dynasties on the bridge. Hardly any families last longer than a century. There's only one we have pictures of. As you'd expect, they're completely exceptional and out of the common run of the bridge traders. They're William and Mary Daniel, about 1670. William was a haberdasher, apprenticed to his father, a haberdasher who was also on the bridge, but he did so well that he was elected an alderman, which he couldn't be because he was a nonconformist, had to pay a fine, and his son similarly was a merchant and an alderman. In 1695, there's a full record of inhabitants, and there are then 101 houses. There are 551 people living on the bridge. The whole of the bridge, or almost completely, was rebuilt in the 17th century. In 1633, the principal or northern part was burnt down. There was then a huge row with Charles I, who wanted all the houses cleared to make it more beautiful. And the Bridge House and the city, of course, want to rebuild because it makes money for them. So as soon as Charles I was defeated in the Civil War, they built this at the north end, quite different from anything earlier. Designed by Edward German, built in 1645 to 9, much more regular, greatly admired. It even had a new water system of pumping it up rather than using buckets. But they only got to the 3rd pier, not the 7th, because they ran out of money. And the significance of that was that there was a gap there. So only the new building was destroyed. You see it burning there. That's its site. And the rest of the bridge survived for a bit longer. Eventually, in 1683, they rebuild the northern end of the bridge, and for the first time, they just give it to contractors to do on building leases for 61 years. There you can see they make a bit of a bodge of it. It's not very regular. Marked in red are the different groups of houses. A mixture of carpenters and investors build them. That's the northeast part of the bridge. But the city was able to say that the roadway must be 20 feet wide, and it specified the sizes of the timbers, and that there must be a regular back line. And because the road is wider, the houses actually go much further up from the bridge. The woodwork has to start much lower down, and that was to cause serious problems later. So then they've got a bridge that's partly 20 feet wide and partly 15 feet wide, and they want the whole bridge to have this wider roadway because the traffic is increasing. They start by introducing lane discipline. In fact, they have a keep right rule in 1670 and change it later in 1722 to a keep left rule, but that isn't good enough. What they want is to have a wider roadway without having to spend any money, and they achieve this by the simple expedient of indicting the leaseholders for the nuisances obstructing the passage, which is the fronts of the houses and the first floor cross buildings, which had, of course, been built at the instigation of the bridge house itself, or indeed by the bridge house. And so they said they would either buy up the leaseholders, or the leaseholders could rebuild themselves and have a longer lease of 61 years. And it's a triumph, really, because they get their wider roadway. The middle part of the bridge is rebuilt in 1684-5, the drawbridge area a year or so later, and the west side south of the Stone Gate in 1696. And here's the bridge after the rebuilding with, in fact, those are rebuilt after a fire in 1725. There's the Stone Gate. Here are houses of the 1680s, Nonsuch House surviving, more 1680s houses and the former chapel, and here some houses rebuilt by Jorge Dance in the 1740s. Because the leases fell in around 1743 to 44, most of them could be relet, but the 10 here were in such bad condition they had to be rebuilt, and Jorge Dance produced an astonishingly boring design for them, which has gone missing, so you can't see it, but it is boring, I tell you that. But they introduced what they called a piazza, or a covered passage, so that under the fronts of the buildings was a pedestrian walkway. And they paid a fixed price, and it was a disaster because completion coincided with a property crash. And the other problem is the posh shopping areas have moved out of the city. Now they've gone to the West End. Also, people are moving against the idea of having houses on bridges. And there's also a suggestion that fire insurance companies are refusing to insure the bridge houses. It was still extremely controversial to remove the bridges. The Common Council voted against it twice. But somehow, probably the aldermen, somebody put a bill to Parliament, and Parliament passed it. So the houses were demolished from 1757 to 1761. The bridge was widened, or the roadway was widened to 45 feet. They built footway goes under the tower, as you see there, of St Magnus. You can still see that. So that's 1826 on the left. And if you go and you can stand in the churchyard there, they cut, for the widened roadway, they cut off a corner of the church, but there you can actually stand where the first shops on the bridge were. They were right up against the wall of St Magnus. Maintenance remained expensive because of the Starlings. In 1823 they get an act for a new bridge, and there in 1832 is the remains of the old bridge being demolished, and the new bridge is appearing on the left, and there is St Magnus. Now, you will hear more about that bridge shortly. Thank you.